There comes a moment, subtle yet deeply unsettling, when a person begins to sense that something has shifted, something they cannot quite name but also cannot ignore. For a long time, they existed within the quiet comfort of your pursuit. Your attention moved toward them like a steady current, dependable, familiar, unquestioned. Within that consistency, they slowly formed an unspoken belief that you would always remain. But now something is different. You have stopped chasing. When someone who was emotionally invested in pursuing, giving, or consistently showing attention suddenly pulls back, it does not just create silence in communication. It forms a deeper psychological disruption inside the other person's inner world. This happens because human beings, especially within emotional dynamics, do not only respond to actions, but to the energy of consistency itself. When someone consistently pursues another, even quietly, through care, presence, or emotional availability, it builds an invisible structure within the other person's mind. That structure becomes part of how they regulate their own sense of identity. They may not consciously think this person makes me feel important, but psychologically, that is exactly what is happening. The presence of pursuit becomes a stabilizing reflection, mirroring back a version of themselves that feels desired, chosen, or emotionally significant. When that pursuit suddenly ends, the mirror does not simply fade, it fractures. And what follows is not instant clarity, but confusion. The mind is naturally pattern-seeking and depends on repetition to feel secure. If someone becomes used to receiving attention, messages, effort, or emotional investment from a specific person, the brain encodes that pattern as expected reality. The moment that pattern is disrupted, the nervous system registers it as something is wrong even before the conscious mind can interpret it. This is why the absence of chasing often feels more intense than its presence. It does not merely remove interaction, it removes predictability. At this stage, the unconscious mind starts searching for explanations that can preserve emotional stability. Instead of immediately accepting they have stopped caring or moved on, the psyche often creates softer narratives. It may assume temporary distance, outside distractions, or a delayed return. This acts as a defense mechanism because accepting the full truth of withdrawal would require the ego to face the possibility of losing significance. The ego resists that because it threatens the internal story of being valued or prioritized. Yet beneath these surface-level explanations, something more subtle begins to form. The absence of pursuit creates a kind of psychological hunger, not necessarily for the person themselves at first, but for the emotional state their attention once created. This is why the reaction is often delayed or indirect. The person may not immediately reach out, but they begin to think more frequently about the one who stepped back. Their attention, once taken for granted, now becomes noticeable precisely because it is no longer there. In psychology, this relates closely to contrast perception. Something is only fully recognized when its absence creates a contrast against its former presence. The emotional system also begins to interpret this shift through the lens of control. When someone is being pursued, consciously or unconsciously, they often feel they hold a certain level of influence within the dynamic. They can respond or ignore, engage or withdraw while the pursuer remains available. But when the pursuer stops, that sense of influence dissolves. Suddenly, the dynamic is no longer centered around them. This creates a subtle internal discomfort because it alters the balance of psychological power. The mind does not tolerate unresolved imbalance easily, so it attempts to restore equilibrium. It may try to do this by reestablishing contact or by mentally reducing the importance of what was lost. This is also where projection begins to surface. Instead of directly processing their own emotional response, the person may project explanations outward. They might assume the other person is playing games, intentionally creating distance or testing them. These narratives are not necessarily true, but they serve to protect the ego from admitting vulnerability, because vulnerability here would mean recognizing that the absence is affecting them more deeply than expected. As time passes, if the withdrawal continues without interruption, the emotional system begins to recalibrate itself. What once existed as background noise starts to become a clear emotional signal. The person begins noticing patterns they once ignored. Memories become more vivid. Moments that felt ordinary when pursuit was present now gain emotional significance in hindsight. This happens because the brain reconstructs meaning based on current absence, not only past presence. At a deeper level, what is truly happening is a forced shift from external validation to internal reflection. As long as attention is consistently received, the mind remains outwardly focused. But when that attention disappears, it turns inward out of necessity. This inward movement is often uncomfortable because it exposes unresolved emotional dependencies, attachment tendencies, or identity structures that were built around being desired. This is why the withdrawal of pursuit is rarely experienced in a neutral way. Instead, it is felt as a layered experience of disruption, loss, curiosity, resistance, and sometimes even fixation, all at once before clarity eventually forms. Attention operates as a kind of psychological currency because it is not merely interaction. It is a signal of value, recognition, and emotional investment that directly shapes how a person sees themselves. Human identity does not develop in isolation. It is continuously shaped and reinforced through feedback loops with others. When someone receives attention, especially consistent and emotionally meaningful attention, the brain interprets it as confirmation of relevance. This may not always rise to conscious awareness, but it is deeply embedded within the emotional system. The experience of being noticed, remembered, and prioritized becomes intertwined with self-worth in quiet and subtle ways. When one person offers sustained attention to another, they are effectively providing a form of psychological validation. This validation communicates to the receiving mind that you matter enough for me to focus on you. Over time, this message becomes familiar, and what is familiar often turns into expectation. The person receiving attention may not actively reflect on it, but their nervous system adapts to it as a stable input. It becomes part of their emotional environment, like a background condition that is assumed to always be there. This is where the idea of currency becomes significant. Just as financial currency regulates access to stability and resources, attention regulates access to emotional certainty and validation. When it is consistently present, it creates a sense of psychological security. The individual feels seen, valued, and emotionally grounded. But the worth of any currency is most clearly understood when its flow is interrupted. As long as attention remains constant, it is rarely questioned or deeply appreciated. It becomes part of the baseline experience. However, when attention is withdrawn, even slightly, the system that relied on it begins to detect a deficit. This deficit is not just emotional in a simple way. It is structural. It influences how the person organizes their internal sense of importance. The absence of attention creates a space where validation once existed, and the mind is driven to respond to that emptiness. It may not immediately appear as a clear longing for the specific individual who withdrew attention, but it often shows up as a general sense of unease or an increased mental focus on that source. On a deeper level, attention also acts as a mirror. When someone gives you attention, they reflect you back to yourself through their reactions, engagement, and responses. This reflection helps stabilize identity because it reinforces a consistent image of who you are in relation to others. Without that mirror, identity becomes less externally confirmed, and the mind begins searching for alternative ways to understand itself or fill that gap. This is why the absence of attention can feel destabilizing, even when the person does not consciously recognize emotional attachment. The psychological reliance on attention does not necessarily point to weakness or a lack of confidence. It is often a natural result of how the human mind is designed to function in social environments. People are wired to observe and interpret signals from others in order to understand their role within social hierarchies, emotional connections, and interpersonal dynamics. Attention serves as one of the most direct and recognizable signals in this process. When someone consistently directs their attention toward another person, it quietly communicates importance and value. The mind begins to notice this pattern and gradually incorporates it into its understanding of self-worth and emotional security. As time passes, this can form an unconscious cycle where attention is no longer just appreciated but subtly anticipated. The anticipation itself becomes deeply influential. Even in moments when attention is not actively being given, the expectation of it continues to shape emotional stability. This is why when attention is suddenly withdrawn or reduced, it rarely feels like a simple absence. Instead, it feels like something essential has been taken away, something that was assumed to naturally exist. The conscious mind may struggle to immediately define what is missing, but the emotional response is already present. This also sheds light on why attention can develop into a quiet form of addiction. It is not always about dependence on a specific individual, but rather about the repeated reinforcement of identity through external validation. Every message, response, or sign of interest strengthens a loop that communicates a sense of significance within a particular context. When this loop is active, it produces a feeling of emotional reward. When it is interrupted, the internal reward system detects a drop, which can lead to overthinking, curiosity, or attempts to reestablish that connection. Within relationships, this is why attention can often carry more weight than direct actions. It is not only about what someone does, but about what they consistently direct toward another person's awareness. Attention itself becomes meaningful. And when it disappears, it does not simply create silence. It initiates a psychological adjustment process where the mind is forced to reconsider what holds importance and where that importance now exists. The ego reacts before conscious awareness has time to fully engage, because the ego represents the first layer of the mind that encounters disruption in emotional or relational patterns. Its function is to preserve stability, maintain continuity of identity, and sustain a sense of control within one's social and emotional surroundings. When something unexpected occurs, particularly a shift in how someone behaves toward us, the ego does not pause to explore deeper meaning. It reacts instantly in an attempt to protect the internal image of self that has been gradually constructed. When a person is regularly pursued or emotionally engaged, even without consciously acknowledging it, a certain balance forms. This balance includes underlying assumptions about availability, importance, and position within the relationship. The ego organizes these assumptions into a stable internal narrative such as, this person values me, this person will respond, or I hold a certain level of influence here. These narratives are not always expressed in words, but they exist as a felt sense of certainty. The mind depends on them to minimize uncertainty in relationships. When that pursuit suddenly ends, this balance is disturbed. The ego does not interpret this as a thoughtful shift, but as a threat to its established framework. It does not immediately question whether the change might be beneficial or necessary. Instead, it registers a loss of control and possibly a loss of importance. This is why the initial reaction is usually defensive rather than reflective. The ego is not focused on discovering truth. Its primary concern is preserving a consistent sense of identity. This preservation can take multiple forms. One of the first responses is often denial. The mind may attempt to reinterpret the situation in a way that reduces immediate discomfort. It may assume the change is temporary, accidental, or unrelated. This creates a buffer that prevents the system from fully confronting the possibility of being deprioritized or receiving less attention than before. If denial is not enough to maintain stability, the ego may shift toward rationalization. It begins to create explanations that protect a sense of dignity and control. For instance, it might label the withdrawal as strategic, intentional, or even manipulative. This reframing allows the individual to maintain a sense of balance or superiority instead of directly facing vulnerability. Rationalization is less about truth and more about emotional protection. It transforms uncertainty into a story that feels easier to manage. Another frequent response is an attempt to regain control. This may appear as sudden efforts to reconnect, test limits, or provoke a reaction from the person who has stepped back. These behaviors are not always deliberate strategies. They are often impulsive reactions driven by discomfort with losing influence. The ego seeks to restore the previous pattern because it is familiar, and familiarity is often interpreted as safety. Even if the dynamic was not deeply fulfilling, it provided predictability, and predictability reduces internal tension. At the same time, there is usually a strong resistance to appearing affected. The ego is highly sensitive to perception, both from others and from within. As a result, alongside attempts to regain control, there may also be outward expressions of indifference. This creates an internal conflict where the individual may feel unsettled internally but present themselves as unaffected externally. This division is a clear sign of ego-driven reaction, where managing appearance becomes just as important as processing genuine emotion. What makes the ego's reaction particularly impactful is how quickly it operates. It moves faster than conscious reflection. Before a person has the chance to fully understand their emotions or interpret the situation, the ego has already generated a response designed to minimize discomfort. This is why early reactions in situations of emotional withdrawal can seem inconsistent or even contradictory. A person may shift between reaching out and pulling away, between curiosity and pride, because different protective mechanisms are activating at different times. Only after this initial phase does awareness begin to surface. Awareness is slower, more thoughtful, and capable of holding complexity. It can recognize that the withdrawal might reveal patterns of attachment, emotional reliance, or imbalance within the relationship. However, by the time awareness begins to develop, the ego has already shaped the initial emotional and behavioral responses. This sequence is important because it explains why people often do not immediately act in alignment with their deeper understanding. The ego reacts first to defend identity, while awareness arrives later to interpret meaning. In the space between these two processes, confusion, contradiction, and emotional instability naturally emerge as the mind shifts from automatic defense toward conscious reflection. Silence then takes on a different role. It becomes reflective. When external interaction is removed, what remains is not emptiness, but the mind's unfiltered projection of itself onto that absence. During regular interaction, attention, conversation, responses, and emotional signals provide a steady external structure. They give the mind something tangible to engage with, interpret, and regulate itself through. But when that flow suddenly stops, the mind does not simply experience nothingness. It begins to interpret that absence. In doing so, it reveals what has always been operating beneath the surface. When someone has been emotionally involved with another person, especially in a dynamic where attention, pursuit, or validation played a role, the silence that follows is rarely neutral. It becomes charged with meaning. The lack of communication forces the internal world to create meaning without external confirmation. The human mind is not comfortable with a lack of meaning. It continuously attempts to build narratives even when there is no new information available. In the absence of messages, actions, or signals, the mind turns inward and begins to rely on memory, fear, desire, and insecurity to fill the space. This is where silence becomes a mirror. The person who is no longer reaching out is no longer shaping perception through ongoing behavior. Instead, the other individual is left alone with their internal impressions of the relationship. These impressions begin to surface more clearly and more intensely. Thoughts and feelings that were previously overlooked or minimized can now rise into awareness because there is no new emotional input to distract from them. The absence of external engagement removes the usual noise, allowing deeper patterns, hidden expectations, and unresolved emotions to become visible in a way they were not before.